Sunday night edition of the pod. Time to get rolling here with more from our draft scouting series. Deandre Ayton today. Looking forward to seeing him, a player that you and I saw in his nascent stages of development at the Hoop Summit in 2016, which was a really weird situation for him. He had such a miserable experience that he didn't go back for the next year's Hoop Summit when he would have been a senior. This was his junior year, and this is a team that had no guards and lost the game by 40. So that had been our initial impression of him, but as a guy going into his senior year, he was definitely behind where some of the other elite guys that we've seen at that event, and he's made great strides, of course. Since then, also saw him at Adidas Nations later that summer as well, going into his senior year. Where do you want to start with him?
I actually saw it in three separate events in 2016 because I saw him 2.5 years ago play against Prolific Prep. And what's striking about Ayton is that while he has certainly improved and there are lots of elements of his game that are at least a little bit different, I think the general contours, the general contours are the same. And what I mean by that is immensely physically talented, on the short list of the most physically talented players of his size that I can remember. But then it is applying that consistently and adding in, I thought that Cleaning the Glass, Falk did a nice job of calling this feel. Could also call it basketball IQ, wherever you want to go in that kind of realm. Those are the areas where I was concerned with him then and where I am still concerned with him now.
Let's talk about that physical profile first, because that is, of course, what makes him stand out the most. 7'5" wingspan, 7'1" height, 9'3" standing reach. Those are very solid numbers for a center. He's an excellent leaper as well, a power dunker around the rim. And I would characterize his movements, I would characterize him as mobile, but not smooth necessarily. He can cover a lot of ground quickly, and it can look pretty good, but he's not the most fluid athlete, even so, I would say. His speed, though, in transition, when he really gets running, which whether that was due to system or his playing a ton of minutes or just that he doesn't really run that hard a lot of times, you didn't see often. But when you did, it was just breathtaking how quickly he could get down the floor. And same thing, even hedging out and pick and roll defense as a switch defender, it showed impressive mobility at times. So that's the good. The next question I want to have, though, I share your concerns about his defense, about his awareness. Certainly has the tools, though, which is a much better place to be in than a lot of guys as a starting point. Whether it's only 2 blocks per 40, whether it's more just not showing a ton of awareness on when to come over and help defense, not being that aggressive as a help defender. What needs to happen for him to become a superstar, to become a player where you're like, yeah, this is a number one pick type of player?
Well, it's interesting because there are a lot of kind of different elements that he can improve on. One way of doing it, which is not the common one for a center, is if he could get better as a switch defender. So kind of goes more towards the Clint Capella model of defensive value rather than the Joel Embiid model, where Joel Embiid, wonderful rim protector, defensive rebounder, all that. And I think Ayton actually has a better chance of being more in the Capella model defensively than Embiid, just because of the recognition. And it's hard always to tell with video, but I don't know why I could feel this, but it didn't feel like he was a great communicator. And you could just kind of with the way the rest of his team was moving. And that's something that guys get a lot better at once they get to the pros, because the demands on the center position change in terms of verbal communication. But on that end, I think that you need to do one or the other to at least get to that level. And then offensively, I think it's just imposing his will more often. I had a note, was more on the defensive end, but I think it's true both ways, is that he doesn't make opponents feel him enough. And I think of the center position as being about a lot of kind of jostling and battling and movement and imposing your will at certain moments. That could be screening. That could be getting an inside seal for a post-up. That could be denying an inside seal at some point. And Ayton, when he does any of those things, he looks great doing it. It's just that he doesn't do them often enough.
Yeah, I think that for him, another guy who you kind of want to put into a stereotype, right? Like the ultra-talented big who's just like kind of undermotivated and doesn't really know the game. But there are aspects of his game that move beyond that, right? There are things that
yes,
you can see where it's not like, oh, this isn't like a dumb player, or this isn't a lazy player, or he doesn't fall into those categories that easily. I think you people like us kind of want to stereotype him initially because that's what we do as human beings. Is we kind of, oh, this is the archetype. Can we fit him into this box? And I think that the more you watch of him, there are some enigmatic elements in both directions, really. Oh,
I want to talk about one of those. So he has surprisingly good passing vision. I don't necessarily think he has the greatest passing instincts, but his vision's like there are a couple plays where he gets doubled and first of all, he also can do escape dribbles, which is pretty exciting for a guy his age, that he can, if he gets doubled, he can get out of it and make a pass. But he can also find guys in the opposite corner and those sorts of reads, not the easy pass, which a lot of guys are getting better at, but he can make the hard pass. And I was really impressed with that. It's another one of the, I don't know that that's really a basketball IQ thing, but it's definitely something you would not expect if one was to pigeonhole him in one of those boxes you were talking about.
Yeah, and he had 57 assists on the year, and then some of these are overlap, but on passes out of the post, when he was double teamed, it's called defense commits is the category on Synergy. 75 passes out of the post. A lot of those are two spot ups. A lot of those were on the weak side. And he set up some really nice plays. Even when it wasn't his pass initially causing the assist, I thought that he had pretty decent recognition of when he was getting doubled, and he got the ball out of his hands quickly and started the churn to get a shot on the weak side, even if necessarily he wasn't finding the guy who was wide open immediately. He said, all right, I'm double teamed. I'm going to give the ball up and not just give it right back to the passer where, there's no advantage gained at all. But he was able to kind of keep things moving and allow his team to take advantage of him being double teamed, which I like. I want to get back, though, to the question of what it would take for him to be a superstar player. Let's say a top 10 player, top 15 player in the NBA. There's a big difference between those, I suppose. But he would have to be, a dominating offensive player. Look at some of the guys who are there. I don't think he's, from a skill level standpoint, he does have a solid jump shot. I don't think a great one. But, he's not going to be Karl Anthony Towns from a shooting standpoint, from a skill in the post standpoint. Now, he's got more physical tools than Towns on the offensive end and defensively as well. I do question, due to the lack of awareness, I think he can be adequate defensively eventually. You mentioned the switching as maybe a way to help that happen. But as a help defender, I don't think he quite has the instinct. And guys could develop that to some degree. But I just don't think he quite has the instincts to really be an elite defensive player as a center. And so now, if you want him to be a superstar, you're talking about a guy who has to be, really just like an awesome offensive player. And I'm not quite sure that he quite can get there. He's solid in the post. He's got a right-hand jump hook, left-hand jump hook. We'll talk more about his post game. But I think he's got some kind of pick-and-pop game. But again, not something that looks like a total bread and butter. You're not seeing this guy and you're like, oh man, this skill level is unbelievable. It's nice, especially when you consider his physical tools. He's certainly above average for a guy with his physical tools in terms of his skill level. But I don't see him as just a dominating, put the ball in his hands type of offensive player. Unless he can just play with so much physicality that, he's getting Shaq-like deep post-ups all the time and stuff like that. I'm not sure that he quite has that in him. So he's not going to ever be 325 pounds like Shaq either. Probably he's going to be very strong and big, but not a guy who is going to be that powerful around the rim, because basically nobody in NBA history done that.
Along those same lines, something that struck me, I watched the game that they played in Oregon, which happened to be right after the allegations came out about his potential, involvement, the Miller stuff, all that. And he played well overall in that game, but it was close. It ended up going to overtime, and in the late second half and in overtime, he just wasn't impacting the game that much offensively because Oregon was able to take him out. They doubled him really once, and then they were just kind of taking away those passes. And it reminded me that in the modern NBA, it is, even if a guy is good, I certainly let's not talk about the Shaq level, because that's a whole different thing, as you just mentioned. But if you're a step below that, it can be harder to maximize those players offensively than anybody else, unless he really gets this lockdown pick and pop game. If he can be kind of a dual threat pick and roll big man, then he could maybe get in that realm. But it's really hard with how good switching is, with how many capable players are on the floor now, to have that linchpin offensively be a center.
Yeah, it is. And Joel Embiid, to whom he has somewhat similar physical measurements, Joel didn't play as much as Kansas. It wasn't featured as much, didn't have the raw stats that Ayton had. But Joel, number one, was just a much better rim protector. And number two, just showed a real smoothness to his skill level that you don't see from Ayton. Now, I think that he has pretty low bust potential because if you just look at the type of guys in NBA history with his physical profile, if you want to go back and some of the names of those who are really like this would be, Shaq obviously is a level beyond where he is. Dwight Howard, Andre Drummond. I use this logic too when talking about Drummond way back in my very early days when in 2012, you'll recall there wasn't really an obvious number 2 overall pick. And I said, well, it should probably be Drummond because if you just look, he had all this rough time at UConn, but with that physical profile, it's pretty hard not to succeed. And he is an excellent rebounder as well, not quite the same level as Drummond. But guys who are good leapers, have good mobility, and are strong and have elite height and length at the center position. I mean, those guys nearly always succeed in some form or fashion. But my questions revolve around, is this guy really a number 1 pick level of player? Number 1 with some of the concerns we already discussed. And number 2, with just the fact that being an absolute top of the league type of player as a center is just very difficult in today's game. And we just haven't seen a center since Shaq really be a top 5 player in the NBA. And so, he doesn't have to be a top 5 player to succeed as the number 1 pick. But, and again, we haven't looked at everyone else yet either to know where he falls in the hierarchy. He might still be the best of all these guys. But I think it is very difficult for me to say just because he's a center, because he's not just absolutely elite type of skill level, to see him as just like that type of upside, which is crazy for people to think because it used to be, oh man, this guy is unlimited upside because he's a center and he has these measurements. But it's just, I don't think that's the case in today's NBA for all the reasons that we've discussed ad nauseum over the last, probably 3-4 months.
A point I want to bring up about Ayton's physical capability. So there was a play, one of the games I watched was
well, actually, here,
can
we do a read first and then we'll get into like some of his more specific characteristics?
Sure.
Because we obviously have a lot more to say on him as well, but I wanted to kind of set the scene overall. And we actually have a new sponsor to tell you about, which is Burrow. I now have a Burrow couch, actually a love seat, sitting in kind of our upstairs reading area, and it's incredibly comfortable. It was created by 2 gentlemen. One was Stephen Kuhl, who in college suffered from 2 herniated discs, and he teamed up with his co-founder, Kabir Chopra, to build a luxury furniture company that maximized comfort and support. These are handcrafted in the same factories as other high-end retailers, but they're delivered for much less and they're shipped for free with an ergonomic design and a built-in USB charger as well, which is nice. These couches have a beautiful mid-century type of look, but definitely not mid-century comfort. It's modern comfort. If you go to burrow.com, BURROW.com, you can select the color, the size, the armrest height, the leg color. I went with their blue color. You can even customize it a little bit because the cushions, if you flip them around, they're either tufted or not tufted, depending on what you think fits better in your home. And you can enjoy 30 days risk-free on your Burrow or try Burrow at one of their partner showrooms as well. And if you don't like it, then of course you can return it. It's shipped in 3 pretty small boxes, all of which were a manageable size and weight. And putting it together, it took me, I think, about 15 minutes or so, I would say. And I was by myself, too. My fiance wasn't available, so I just did the whole thing myself. It really was not very difficult at all. Don't need any tools to put it together. And then obviously, if you need to move, you can take it apart if you need to. The way to get started with Burrow, once again, that's BURROW.com. And then the link is, of course, /capspace. Burrow.com/capspace. They'll get you $75 off your order. Once again, burrow.com/capspace. Burrow makes the luxury couch for real life. Yeah, so where were you going to go here, starting to talk about some of the specific aspects of this game?
So there was a play in the Pac-12 title game where Ayton was in good defensive position, got a stop on Metu, and then he, finishes out the play, does it well, and still he's on the baseline and beats every single player, guards, forwards, centers included, to the other side of the floor. And I'm just sitting there going, how the hell did that happen? Because you don't see centers, especially 7-1 centers, do that. And so it's the idea that this is a little bit of a different thing physically than some of these other players we're talking about. Like, he is, on those elements, his second jump is good as well. Like, that's part of what led to some of his rebounding numbers. So, like, he has just crazy physical profile. And also, generally speaking, I liked his feet and his footwork too. I talked about his potential as a switch defender. Some of that is the way he can shuffle chop his feet. Also, his footwork on post-ups is pretty good. So he has a lot of those elements as well, which are kind of bridge the line between physical talent and skill. And I was impressed with those too.
Yeah, we mentioned in transition, doesn't run very often, but when he does, it's just pretty ridiculous. Now, generally, you're not going to see guys who are big superstars sprint the floor every time. They just don't necessarily have the energy to do that. But the fact that he has that capability is nice, and it should be effective for him in particular early in his career. I want to go back to the switch defending, because that to me is a big part of how good can this guy be, especially at the highest levels where we've seen Clint Capella, Anthony Davis, those guys. Just some of these teams, it seems like you almost have to switch everything against if you're really at the highest levels of basketball. And I expect that to be the case for some time now going into the future. And especially when you consider that, I don't see him as an elite rim protecting center. He could get there. He's got the tools, but, just doesn't seem to have those instincts, the timing with the shot blocking. So if you look at the number of possessions where he defended in isolation, only allowed 25 points on 38 possessions, which is obviously a very good number. It's college. Not a lot of space for isolations, not the absolute greatest guys going against him a lot of times. These are not like elite guards like he's going to have to face in the NBA on these plays most of the time. I didn't really see him particularly affecting the shot on a lot of these. Like, as far as he could kind of stay in front of the guy, he moves quickly. His technique is not amazing. He'll turn his hips, let guys kind of get by him. Not really that much of a threat to block the shot from behind once he's beaten. Again, which we've seen a lot of from Capella in these playoffs. Also, I didn't think that, when he really did get switched onto a quicker guard, that he wasn't really able to get a hand up and contest the jump shot all that well, to really transition from the sliding into getting a hand up and contesting. That moment when the guy picks up his dribble, how quickly you can get a hand up is a big part of being a good switch defender at the NBA level. So again, his mobility looks pretty good. If you really dig into it, I think at this point, talking about how good he is as a switch defender is a little bit overrated. Maybe, again, he can get there, but...
Well, let me draw the difference. It's more about capability rather than what he is right now. It's just,
and that's the case for all these 19-year-olds that we're looking at.
Sure. Yeah. And I also thought the value for him as a switch defender, there will be issues certainly with guards, but there were a series of plays where he was on more of like a small forward-sized guy, and I thought he looked better there just because the quickness advantage was muted a little bit. And you'll have to, a switch center was going to have to do all of those. It's not like, oh, you only get to choose to switch onto threes. But there were some pieces there. And the other reason why I brought up that instead of the interior, being that kind of traditional center defender is because I think there's a higher potential of it, even though it's not great either way, just because the recognition and all that at the center, the center type stuff is there. And one play I wanted to bring up as an example here, I think it was in that same SC game. It was the last play of the first half, and basically a guard is driving in. Ayton is the help defender in this circumstance. He is not switched onto the guy. He's just reacting to the situation. And he, instead of really getting in front of either the roll man or the ball handler, he kind of puts his hand where he thinks the pass is going to be. And he is one step away from doing either one of those things and just does neither of them. And that's not what you want to see from a guy who could potentially be a defensive center.
And again, let's note that his mobility for a guy this size, is above average. The fact that we're even talking about his potential as a switch defender is a good thing. The one play that was most hilarious to me was they're up 6 against ASU with under 2 minutes left. He gets switched onto this guard and starts doing like the Morpheus, like come hither with his hand. He's got like his hand out and he like turns it back towards himself to be like, hey, come here to like talk shit to the guy. And right as he did that, the guy just banged a 3 right in his face. It's pretty funny. Let's get to some of the stats on him. 13.5% offensive rebound rate, 28.2% defensive rebound, and that's pretty damn good considering that he also was playing next to a traditional center, Ristich, a lot of the time. Also, when you talk about his situation, worth noting that he had to defend on the perimeter more than a lot of traditional centers. I mean, he was playing the 4 a lot of the time just because they had this other guy, Ristich, who was just like totally ground-bound, slow center. 2-point block rate, 6.1%. That's not amazing for a guy of his size. 27% usage. That's good to see, though, that he's able to create those number of shots and to be a 20 and 10 guy. You don't see a lot of these guys. He wasn't on an absolutely loaded team, but you don't see a lot of these guys get up to 20 points a game. So maybe there's the point that maybe we're underselling his offensive upside a little bit if he's able to create this many shots. Didn't turn it over a ton for college, only 11%, and in college, turnover rates are huge. They're almost as much as like 20% in college. And True shooting was great, 65%. Also 73% from the foul line, which is encouraging again for a big of his ilk. And only 35 three-point attempts on the year. He went 34%, 12 out of 35, and did shoot just an incredible percentage at the rim, depending on what site you consult. It was as high as 82% at the rim per hoop math. For some of Synergy's metrics, it was a little bit lower, but certainly an excellent finisher at the rim from a statistical standpoint, though I'm a little bit lower on how that might translate to the NBA. What other part of his game do you want to talk about?
Something that I found absolutely fascinating with Ayton, and this ties into when we saw him a couple years ago, he popped substantially more than he rolled. So it was 63 pops, and he had about 0.9 points per possession, 22 rolls, and 1 point per possession. So the pop number is better than you would expect per possession, and the roll number is worse. Some of that is because he doesn't always finish strong over a solid contest. Sometimes he just kind of tries to avoid it and maybe go to the other side or gets a little bit too cute with it, and those can be problematic for him. He can be a threat both places. I also think that in that specific element as a roll man in a pick and roll, having Ristich out there was a negative because it would just bring another guy into the action. Improved floor spacing could just create those. We just saw this in the NBA Finals all those times where there just isn't any resistance, and in those circumstances, he will do super well. But a general criticism I have had of Ayton forever is that he is too confident and too comfortable with his jump shot. Like, I think his jump shot will be good. I think it will move into a place for his size that provides value, but he needs to see it more as like a last resort rather than, oh, I'm open, I should just shoot it. And I think that can happen with coaching. It should happen with coaching. But sometimes for players like that have that kind of mentality, it can be hard to break, especially if it hasn't broken yet.
Yeah, I agree with you on the pick and roll finishing. That was disappointing. The lack of space was part of that. But also I think, when he would catch the ball coming down the lane, he didn't have a great feel for where the defense was. He wasn't a guy who was able to kind of catch, make a fake, take a dribble, and go up very well. He'd just kind of get caught. There'd be a body on him. He wouldn't throw up a great shot, or he might travel or something as the defense came over. Not really comfortable as well as a 1 foot finisher, which doesn't matter as much for a big as it does for a guard because he's not going to be putting the ball on the floor and driving to the rim and going off a 1 foot. But he's not as explosive off a 1 foot. Not a guy who you see doing like a bunch of kind of Euro steps to just avoid help defenders in a roll situation. The shot is interesting. Doesn't shoot jumpers off the dribble, really. I think he only attempted one of those all year. Very quick release, though, which is nice. And he kind of kicks his legs out in a weird way. He's not perfectly on balance a lot of times. And he shoots a flat shot. Again, it's a shot that can go in. If you think of him as a face-up guy rather than as a post-up guy, because he does like to face up. He was 8 out of 22 on face-up jumpers without driving. And I think he can put the ball on the floor, but I don't quite trust him to make the decision once he's faced the basket and started his drive, if the help comes there, as opposed to kind of catching the ball in the post and making an immediate decision. It's easier to do that than in the post than when you're on the move. But he did have some nice moments facing up and driving. One really sick play that he had, which we didn't see much of, but he caught the ball at the free throw line, faked, took a dribble to his right against Alabama, and then went behind his back like really quickly and went in the lane and got a foul. That was pretty impressive. He's got like pretty decent spin moves as well. And one of the nice, you'll see this out of the post for him too. One of the nice things is like a lot of guys, if you're not strong enough and you spin, you kind of bounce off the guy and then can maybe travel or just kind of, not have your momentum to the basket get stalled. He's so strong that when he spins, as he's spinning, he can knock the guy backwards as well. That's very difficult to do and create some space. On his finishing game, so on shots noted as around the basket, but not post-ups by Synergy, 1.48 points per possession. That's basically 75%. That's pretty damn good. I think his hands, just, as a finisher on dump-offs, his hands are okay. I wouldn't call them great, although he does have really big hands. His touch is average, I would say. He'll go for kind of these weird reverses sometimes instead of really trying to go up and dunk on someone. He'll also catch the ball and take an unnecessary dribble down low on occasion. But when he really has a chance to explode up on these dunks, it looks pretty good. I mean, he can catch it, not only kind of half bring the ball down and still be able to go right back up with the dunk if there's kind of a lob play or something like that. And then he does have a decent left hand, which is nice. You don't, and I think that the left-handed, like, pure jump hook from, like, 10 feet away is one of the most overrated shots in basketball. Like, every big wants to be able to shoot that shot just to, like, show how skilled they are, but it's like, on your offhand jump hook, like, unless you're like David Lee or someone, like, you're just not going to be effective with that shot. It's going to be a 35% shot, but he does have like a very short range lefty hook and layups. So that's a really important play for a big man. You know, if you're 4 feet away from the rim and you're going up and you've kind of got a guy in between you and the ball, or you and the basket. So that's good. Again, not the greatest touch, but does have big hands and doesn't get amazing extension on his finishes or on his hook shot, but it's still pretty good. And given his physical tools, especially as he gets better at just creating space for those shots, I think it can be very effective.
A couple other things I wanted to bring up. One, I mentioned this a little bit before, but it needs to be brought up, is that he is, at this point in his career, an awful screener.
Yeah.
I brought this up with Bagley as well. I think a lot of guys just aren't encouraged to.
Well,
and he has the physical capability of being a damn good screener.
You don't want to pick up if you're a big in college when they're looking for any.
Oh, that's something else we should talk about.
You don't want to foul.
Is how many minutes he played. This was absolutely insane. So he was average 33 and a half, but in the late games in the season, he was basically playing all the time. I had a note in there when I was watching a couple of the different games going, did he sit in the second half? And the answer was generally no. And they needed him. Arizona dealt with a whole bunch of stuff over the course of this season. And I don't know whether him playing fewer minutes, balancing that out, giving him more rest, even just having quarter breaks as opposed to being in two halves, will make that difference in terms of intensity. Maybe it will a little bit and help. That is one thing that was concerning, but hopefully can be improved. And then another one I wanted to bring up, and this kind of goes into that whole box with basketball IQ, is there was a huge play late in the Arizona State game where Arizona was up 5 and they got a steal off an air pass. It ended up in Ayton's hands in their half because it was a steal in the defensive half. And the clock's running down and he just freezes with the ball. And so you're sitting there going, oh, well, that's weird. Like he could have passed off, tried to do anything like that. He just froze until the double got there. And then when the double got there, he freaked out, missed his teammate who was open, and just threw the ball right to an Arizona State guy who drilled a 3. And it's not like you're going to, condemn a guy for one play, but it would just kind of combined with a couple of the other things that made me uncomfortable. It's like, okay, getting into the situation, just being calm and just making an easy pass because you're up 5 with, I think it was like 30 seconds to go. And it just stuck with me.
Yeah. I mean, he definitely will have those brain fart plays every once in a while. He's not the most natural feel, not the most fluid player, to be sure.
Oh, I had one more I wanted to mention like that. I have this note in there. I wrote, paralleling offense, getting physical with Ayton early works, and that I could see him getting ducked in on and just getting, not necessarily outplayed, but just getting frustrated by big men who try. Like those guys who are more effort-based and just kind of get into it. Actually, Kevin Love, I think, could really, in certain circumstances, just piss off Deandre Ayton, getting into spots, using his arms and all that kind of stuff. And I think once Ayton learns the tricks to the trade, he'll get a lot better at that. But you saw it throughout. It's like these guys who are smaller than him or who aren't nearly as physically gifted are just getting into good positions. And I hope that he can get better at that because otherwise that negates some of the advantage he has.
Yeah, and I didn't see him be just overly physical, but he did compete enough to where if he was being fronted, they're able to throw the ball over the top to him pretty well. I mean, he wasn't just like shoving the guy way up the lane, but he was getting his body into him enough. And again, like, he's so big that he doesn't even have to like try that hard to just get good angles in the post. They would throw it over the top to him. It looked pretty good. Or if he was going to try, they'd run a lot of plays where he would set a pick and roll and then try to get position on the block or something like that. And I thought that looked pretty good for him. And certainly against switches, he's able to get post pins pretty easily. I also want to talk about his offensive rebounding and to some extent defensive rebounding too. This comes into play. I just love the way, this is one of those things that kind of goes against the idea of like, oh, he doesn't have that great a feel. I love the way that he would just tip the ball to himself. I think way more rebounders should do that in situations where it's much easier to get one hand on the ball than two. And so if you're in a situation where it's like, all right, if I go for this with two hands, someone else is going to tip it first. Well, if you can tip it to yourself, like then you can prevent someone else from getting one hand on it and tipping it away from you. I mean, he did that so many times, especially on the offensive glass, and was able to do it without fouling. I thought that was pretty impressive and a nice, the way that he pursues the ball as a rebounder, just overall, is pretty impressive. I mean, every once in a while, he won't react that quickly enough, but and especially if he's guarding a shooter, that was something that both being able to come off the shooter and protect the rim and then get back out there, not that many 7-footers or a 19 could do that, or even when he's guarding a shooter, what you can do is when a shot goes up, you can run towards the defensive backboard. You wouldn't necessarily do that as much either, show like great out of area rebounding necessarily, but he takes up so much space down there and has such a wide radius that he turns out to be an excellent rebounder anyway.
Yeah, I was very impressed with his rebounding, and the idea of tipping it to yourself, another analogy that you and I have talked, it happened in the NBA Finals, of throwing the ball off the backboard to yourself if you're kind of stuck. The idea being that where you're putting the ball, an opponent has to react to it. And I think Ayton did a pretty good job of that, of kind of knowing where that space was. And as you said, I think that's where the game is going. And I think he could end up being, if you get into a system, and this is becoming more common in the league, where you have kind of set areas where your teammates are going to be, he could get good at tipping the ball to teammates instead of just trying to grab it himself and going, saving that extra step. I could see him being good at that and, connecting with him, especially with the decreased emphasis on offensive rebounding that is becoming more prevalent in the NBA now.
Well, so what do you think of him overall then? I mean, I don't know if I want to rank him since we haven't done some of these other guys quite yet, but just what do you think of him overall as a prospect here?
I think it's going to take a while with him to see everything, but his physical capability is going to be there early. I'm more skeptical of his defensive ceiling now than I was before, just because and this isn't from my own knowledge, but I've heard so much about Sean Miller as a defensive coach, and that he did get a little bit better, but didn't get a ton better over the course of that season.
Yeah.
Maybe fewer
and
minutes.
And all these Arizona guys were like, they
help.
play the pack line defense, like they just don't block shots or get that many steals. Well, Aaron Gordon hasn't really, these other guys from Arizona haven't really been like, oh wow, Sean Miller was holding me back from getting blocks and steals, so now I'm getting all of them in the pros, and it doesn't really seem to happen.
Right, and I am impressed with his rebounding, and I don't know if you read it, but I really enjoyed the piece that Ben Falk did for Cleaning the Glass. It was mid-season, but the framing of it was on this idea of if you put the skills or like attributes of an NBA player into can teach and can't teach, because it's a wide line. Ayton has an appallingly large amount of the stuff that you can't teach, but the question is, how much of the other stuff can you live without? Because he'll probably get better at certain elements of it. I expect that he will, but in order to be like a star or a superstar, you have to have that base and the capability. And so I feel like, as you said, that his floor is comfortably high. I think that's a good element with him, and he's just so capable that I could see him, even if let's say he ends up playing, second unit minutes, I could just see him beasting on second unit centers, either taking them inside, taking them outside, depending on that guy's attributes. And there's a lot to like with him, but I also think that he's kind of coming around partially at the wrong time in terms of overall impact. I could see him being more efficient because there's so much more spacing now, but it's hard to see him as a go-to guy.
Yeah, I don't love him just because of some of the reasons that we talked about, and maybe this is my own biases of liking guys who have more feel and more moves, but you can't ignore the physical attributes, and then the fact that he, when you consider those physical attributes, has an above average skill level for those attributes on the offensive end, to be sure. Now, is he going to be a 25-point a game scorer efficiently? I'm not quite sure I can get there yet. Could happen, but he doesn't quite seem to have that skill. But, if you go back and look at like an Anthony Davis or, some of these other bigs, even Karl Anthony Towns, although we saw him outside of the Kentucky sphere as a much more skilled player than he was able to show there. Those are two of the best offensive bigs in today's game. I don't see Ayton, as I said, with that type of smoothness. But I think when you throw in the offensive boards, when you throw in running the floor, throw in pick and roll, pick and pop, and then I think a solid post-up game. I don't know if he's going to be a guy that you're going to want to just throw the ball to against another center, but certainly off of switches or opportunity post-ups. I see him probably being capable of being a 20-point a game scorer, if not maybe the absolute lead dog on an offense. But the biggest, if he looked better defensively, I'd be like, oh yeah, this guy, absolute number one pick for sure. Feel great about it. But my memory of guys who didn't look like they were good defenders in college as bigs, who got there in the pros and developed great defensive awareness in the pros. Not a lot of guys on that list that I can recall. So I think he's going to be more like an average NBA center defensively. Maybe the switching gets him above that, but there's still a lot of things, a lot of boxes that need to be checked, a lot of evolution that needs to happen in ways where maybe it doesn't always happen to make me feel like this guy is a surefire superstar. I'm not going to say that like he's a terrible pick as the number one pick. And again, we'll have to talk about the other guys later on. And, but certainly even if we haven't watched much of Jackson or Bamba yet, for example, if you compare him to those guys, a more effective offensive player certainly than either of the two guys by a mile in terms of his production in college, even in a tough system in terms of spacing. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think he's going to be a bad player. I don't think that he's going to be a bust, but I'm not like, oh man, this guy, he's right up there with like some of my favorite number one picks, that we've seen in the last 10 years or something. I'd say he doesn't just jump off the screen to me as like, yes, this guy is on the level of, the number one overall picks that we in college sometimes.
I'm not comparing their games at all, but I remember wondering about DeMarcus Cousins defensively. When he was at Kentucky, Cousins was a different kind of undeniable physically, because he's just so big. He's so, and the way that Cousins moves for his size is fascinating still. But the idea of just not bringing the kind of recognition and effort on that end was a concern of mine when he was at Kentucky, and that largely carried over. And there aren't, as you said, there aren't that many parallels. And he has to do so much to get to, let's say, top 10 defense, which is, I think, really where the level would be with his offense to become one of the absolute best centers in the league. And the other big question with him that we haven't talked about enough that I think we should is, will he be good enough on either end of the floor to stay on the floor against the best of the best if the league goes where we think it's going to go? And you're not thinking about Deandre Ayton facing the current Rockets or the current Warriors, but we are thinking about him in a league that is going in that direction. And I think he can attack switches well enough and be able to go after mismatches, but defensively, there are certainly concerns. And then offensively, we've saw those guys get kind of marginalized in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, I mean, and when we say stay on the floor, we're talking about it's very likely he'll be a large enough piece of whatever team he's on that they're just going to play him because he's just one of their better players. But I understand what you mean in terms of just how well does he translate against those. I mean, I don't see a team that he's on that invested the resources in him also being like, oh, we have another small option that's better than this guy. But certainly you wonder again about how effective he can be in more of this small ball era. All right, we'll talk Phoenix Suns, who are widely projected to draft Ayton, and we'll talk a little bit about his fit there as well with them in just 1 second here. Before we talk Suns, though, let me tell you about Simple Contacts. My fiance has contact lenses and has long lamented the time and effort and expense required to renew her prescription and purchase the contacts. So I introduced her to Simple Contacts, and in under 5 minutes, she was able to renew her prescription through an online self-guided vision test. And when I first showed it to her, she was like, oh, 5 minutes, that's a long time. I'm like, well, actually, you're going to completely renew your prescription, because she thought it was just, she would put in her prescription and order it. I'm like, no, this is even better than that. They will renew your prescription for you. And then she was like, oh yeah, that just saved me hours to not have to go to the doctor's office and make an appointment. And especially if you're someone who works during the day, it's tough to find time to go and do that. And you don't want to do it on the weekend because that's your time off. What's more, their contact lens prices are unbeatable. The vision test is only $20 and shipping for them is free. Now, it is worth noting that this is prescription renewals. They test that your current prescription still helps you see 20/20, and they renew that prescription. They're not going to examine eye health or write you a completely new prescription. You still should go see someone to examine your eye health on a regular basis. But if you're just renewing your prescription, Simple Contacts is the way to go. Best of all, my listeners get $30 off their first Simple Contacts order. The way to do that is you go to simplecontacts.com/dunk, different code this time, DUNC, simplecontacts.com/dunk, or you can enter the code DUNK at checkout as well. Again, that's simplecontacts.com/dunk, or enter code DUNK, DUNC, that is, at checkout for $30 off your contacts, and of course, crucially, to let them know that you came from us. So let's start first with Phoenix. I'm a little concerned just about how they have been these last few years, and then fitting another guy who has kind of questionable defensive intelligence into that mix. Now, certainly with the number one pick, you shouldn't be worrying about fit at all. You should just take whoever you think is the best guy. And they have Kokoshkov now, who I don't know that much about his coaching, but it would be nearly impossible for him not to be an upgrade on what they've had in the last few years defensively. And, guys like certainly Marquise Chris is not a great fit with Ayton. Maybe Bender is, but, those guys aren't good enough that it should really enter in. So if they really think Ayton is the best guy, I have no problem with them taking him.
I don't have a problem with it either. They're in that mold where the only guy that I would even slightly consider that for would be Devin Booker, and I haven't watched enough Doncic yet to have a firm opinion on it, but I don't think that one precludes the other. But let's get into their cap situation, just because I think this is interesting with them, because Phoenix could be anywhere from right around at the cap if they keep their kind of fungible pieces to about 20 million under, and the big pieces to consider there are three. One is Alan Williams. He has a 5.5 million non-guarantee. This was largely a lost season to him, unfortunately, and his guarantee date is July 6th, so it is pretty early on. Alex Len, who signed his qualifying offer, so he will be unrestricted, but has an $8 million hold. And Elfrid Payton, who they acquired for a second-round pick at the deadline, he is restricted with a $10 million hold. So keep all three of those guys on their holds on the books. You're at the cap, and then that goes all the way to about 20.
Williams, I would not expect them to retain, especially when you just think of like, hey, if we wanted to get another center on a 1-year, $5 million deal, you could probably get someone who's better than him. He was productive earlier, but then it had that meniscus injury, did not look good late in the year, though obviously he was returning there. But I don't see him as a guy who there's going to be any kind of that demand for. I mean, worst case, you could always waive him and then re-sign him for less. I think there's about a 0% chance that if they waived him with that he would get claimed. So I think he's gone. Len is talking about believing that he's probably going to be elsewhere. I think that is probably correct.
And it's also worth noting with both those guys that if they draft Ayton, there's really not a need for spending that much money at center, because I presume if they bring Ayton in, they'll want a solid vet. That could be Tyson Chandler, it could be somebody else, but they'd want that. And so between those two guys, you probably have the minutes at center spoken for. And I mean, Bender should probably get some minutes at the 5 as well.
Played Chris at the 5 also. So I don't think they would need a ton at center. And there's just really, who knows what Len's price tag is going to be, but especially if they draft Ayton, like Len's not going to want to be there. I wouldn't expect them to make Len any kind of significant offer. And then, so it really gets down to Payton, which is an interesting one. I mean, you remember they got him for a song. He did not play particularly well in a Phoenix uniform. Again, was just, one of the worst plus minus guys, especially on defense, amazingly, in Phoenix, although Booker didn't play a lot. That was one downside of Booker's late season injury / them taking their asses off, was that you didn't get to see how well those guys fit together. I don't believe that they do fit well together, because Booker is a guy you want to have the ball in his hands running pick and roll, and Elfrid Payton you don't have to guard at the 3-point line. So it gets a lot more difficult. I mean, I think really the number one decision that they'll need to make in Phoenix, and they've been talking about this of like, oh, hey, we're going to get back into the free agent market. We're going to do more. But I'm not really sure that this is the time for that, especially if you're drafting a number 1 overall pick. They have to get some kind of point guard in there, I guess. So we can talk about who that'll be. But I think they would just be much better off taking on some bad salary with that $20 million. But then the issue becomes 2019, they probably want to have some space going forward. And, they can have 40 million or so in space at that point, although they are likely to extend Booker, you would think, before then, and that'll cut into that. But they could have enough space for a max contract in 2019. But most of the contracts that they would take on are going to be contracts that run through 2020, although you could always maybe just stretch one of those if you really have some awesome free agent signing for 2019, which I doubt that they will.
And while there are a lot of teams that would love to cut some salary, it's a lot harder to get the real assets for a 1-year deal. Those kinds of circumstances, I mean, whether you're talking about Jason Smith or somebody like that, or even a bigger contract, there aren't that many big expirings around the league right now.
One.
I will also, Bayless. I think they would be a logical one with Bayless. And one other note, you said about 40 million. That is a good number to use as a base. They could also stretch Brandon Knight. Remember, he's on this team.
Yeah, they're talking about him actually coming back and playing for them next year. So he missed the whole year with the ACL.
Sure. But so if they want to stretch him next summer, then that could move them to about 50 million. And so then you start to talk about, okay, you could do whatever you want with Devin Booker, extend him now if you want, and still get somebody at the max. Then the math gets even easier. And the nice thing about it, waiting on the stretch provision is then you could just see where you are. If you need to do it, you can. If you don't need to, then you won't. And a couple other just kind of housekeeping decisions that I think are going to be interesting for them, and then we could get into some of the bigger talks. Tyler Ulis, minimum non-guarantee. He actually guarantees, I think it's right around draft day. Shaquille Harrison, who played a lot in that kind of tanking their ass off section of the season. He doesn't guarantee until August 1st.
He showed some
and then
promise,
Devon
though.
Reed,
I think
who
they'll stick around with him.
Yeah, unless they need that extra, couple 100,000, I would probably keep Harrison around.
Yeah.
And then Devon Reed had a lost season. He's half guaranteed, but I would fully anticipate he'll be a part of the team. I mean, they drafted him. I think he was 32nd, and he looked pretty good when he was healthy. He just wasn't healthy for him.
Let me ask you this: and who is a part of the next good Suns team who's on the roster right now? I mean, and maybe some of I'm saying like that you're thinking of as a starter or like for sure key rotation.
For me, it's Devin Booker, and that's it for sure.
Yeah.
There are other guys who could be. I mean, if Chris steps up, if Bender steps up, I like TJ Warren a lot. And another guy who's like, oh yeah, he's on this team. We like him when he can be on the floor. I'd love to see what Warren can be on a better team.
Yeah.
But
he's tough, though.
He could be Josh Jackson. Certainly
starter.
Could be.
Warren is just with the total regression of his 3-point shot to the extent that it ever improved because he wasn't shooting a high volume that one year when he hit the 40%. But yeah, I mean, they signed him to that 4-year, $50 million extension that kicks in this year. Amazingly, it seems like ages ago that they even signed him to that contract. But he's probably not tradable on that deal as of this point, but could maybe become so. But he seems like more of a bench scorer type of guy than a starter at this point.
Yeah, and I'm guessing Josh Jackson would be the one that most people would have, and he can certainly step up. He looked better to me towards the end of the year. But again, I don't think he is at the level yet where I would say, oh, you don't want to draft a perimeter player kind of filling his niche because you have Josh Jackson. I think he could step into that this year. Hopefully he plays Summer League. I haven't heard anything definitively on that. But he isn't, as of this point, for what I know, I wouldn't have him in that, definite starter conversation.
Yeah, which is a disappointment, certainly with the number 4 overall pick. They, of course, I'm sure are higher on him. And then you just look at these players. I mean, how many even like effective starters do you have on this team? You're bringing in another rookie with the number 1 overall pick. He's unlikely to play effective winning basketball this year. I think that's the case, especially if it's Ayton defensively. And they have sucked so badly defensively for so long. Yeah, Kokoshkov might help a little bit with that, but they just don't have the horses in terms of the personnel. So to me, it's very easy that this cap space should be used to take on bad money. Peyton, to me, doesn't move the needle at all. I might hold on to his cap hold until you need to do something else in terms of taking on bad money. But I think that I wouldn't even want to give him, a $10 million a year contract. Maybe if it could be a low enough number to where you'd be okay with him as a backup if it doesn't work out with him as a starter, and you just start the year with he and Knight together, then maybe. But the chances of Peyton taking a deal like that are exceedingly low. He would probably just take his qualifying offer beforehand. I mean, I could even see them just kind of letting him out of the qualifying offer eventually, because again, they didn't give up much to get him, and they have 1 billion second-round picks here anyway, and they don't really have a ton of roster slots, so it's not like those second-round picks were huge. And then the point I was going to make, though, is I don't think there's any players that you could get with your $20 million in cap space who are going to get you anywhere close to playoff contention, especially in the Western Conference as it is right now, where it's a pretty high bar to get into the playoffs, as we saw this year. So it really would not make sense to me, but some of the noises coming out of there, especially if they didn't use their space last year, might augur a little bit differently.
They could certainly be in that circumstance like the Knicks were in back in 2016, where the right decision is to wait, but the pressures on McDonough, if Sarver feels that kind of pressure on them, are more immediate, and that could lead to some mistakes, especially if it's on a multi-year contract. If it's on a single-year thing, that's largely okay. It wouldn't be necessarily the best use of resources, but they might go in that direction. And maybe what they could try to convince themselves of is, like, for example, they would be a logical team to talk with the Denver Nuggets, because the Nuggets have all this expiring money if they're trying to get under the cap. And so if they could say, hey, Kenneth Faried, like, he would help make us better, he's a solid vet, that sort of thing, they could go in that sort of direction. Another option for this, Charlotte is not asset rich, but I was thinking about the idea because actually not only do the Suns have this money in one expiring contracts, they have expiring contracts of their own. So theoretically, they could do something involving, like, let's say, Jared Dudley and Dwight Howard. Like, so Dwight Howard makes a lot more money, but they could use cap space, or they could combine a couple of their expiring contracts to make that work. There are a couple different ways to do that. The problem is assets, and there just aren't that many teams for those conversations, but I think they have to have a lot of those. So maybe the kind of silver lining in this is if they can get a vet who is more likely to contribute, that can satiate ownership if ownership is feeling more win now pressure, rather than spending on somebody who doesn't really make as much sense with this team, especially because they have no idea what they have in a lot of these guys. It's not even the idea where like Chris or Bender, where you're sitting there going, oh, well, in a couple of years they'll be this. They're just not there yet. We have no idea what these guys are on a good team.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and Bender, Chris, I mean, maybe what you could see is like some of these young guys get traded and they try to bring in more talent that way to take a step forward towards the playoffs. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that. Not that I think that Chris in particular, if he has any value, I probably would look to move him because I'm just not high on his potential. Some of the guys are being talked about in the range of their number 16 pick, which they got from the Heat. They're still owed another one from the Heat in 2021, totally unprotected. And then they have that reverse protected one from the Bucks that probably won't convey until 2020 now, it looks like. But Zaire Smith from Texas Tech is someone who's being talked about in their range. That's who ESPN has him going to at this point. There are a lot of wings like Jerome Robinson, although he's a point guard, but he's 6'5", or Troy Brown is in that range. Aaron Holiday is a point guard, is in that range. I mean, maybe they might draft a point guard and hope that he can actually contribute this year. So that looks like what's going to be around for them, and certainly getting more wings, especially some who can shoot, would be useful for them. What else we got to talk about with these guys?
Well, so it was something that I was wondering about, just as an asset proposition, would you be interested in making an offer to one of the kind of higher profile restricted free agents, the guys I was thinking? So I think they're not going to clear enough money to really be in the Capella Jokic mix. I also don't think that makes much sense, especially if they're
they were being regarded as a suitor for Capella, but I believe that was before they got the number 1 overall pick, wasn't it?
I believe so. And I mean, if they draft Ayton, they should not sign Clint Capella. That just doesn't make sense, unless you're just doing it as a troll. But it's not like they're worried about the Rockets right now.
Yeah, and there's other guys that you can do as a troll offer that might actually help you,
Right. And so I was thinking about Aaron Gordon and Jabari there. I don't particularly love the fit of either of those guys on this Suns team.
Yeah, Jabari and
but
Booker
maybe
together
if their market taps out a little bit. Oh, my God.
Defensively, and then Gordon, maybe as the 4, but like he and Josh Jackson, those two guys as your 3 and 4 are probably not a good enough shooting tandem. So that's not amazing. What about them as a Marcus?
And Booker can't switch.
Yeah. What about them as a Marcus Smart destination? What if they brought in Marcus Smart to be their, or gave him a decent offer sheet to be their starting point guard?
I think it's definitely an interesting idea. There is a concern if Josh Jackson's jump shot isn't fixed that you could have those two guys run together, but he could certainly help just build that mentality. Right. And what I like about Smart's fit there is that he could scale down into be a high value backup. I'm sure that's not what he wants, but if they get somebody above him, let's say they take a point guard at 16 and that guy ends up being good, then you can have Smart as kind of a jack of all trades. And I'm guessing the rate that he's going to get, that'll probably be workable, as like a valued 6 man. So I'm okay with it. I don't think it's necessarily the best use of resources because he's going to get a presumably a 3 or 4 year contract. And so then that cuts out, that's your one bet. Your bet is Marcus Smart instead of whatever they can get next year. And I would be interested in kind of on a lesser note with that. Oh, actually, before I get into that, one thing I want to talk about was, again, evaluation standpoint, how much they want the ball in Devin Booker's hands moving forward. Like, is he more of an Oladipo 2 where you can put more of an off-guard 1 next to him and have it work? Or do you want a real, ball dominant, gonna drive and dish, gonna do all that kind of stuff? Because how you allocate resources for point guards is affected dramatically by what you want Booker to be.
Yeah, and I think in theory, Knight offensively is not that bad of a fit next to Booker as a guy. Much as we complain about him and he was awful 2 years ago and then missed this year with the ACL, and it's unlikely that he regains the form that got him that contract to begin with, which was an overpay, of course. But in theory, his ability to shoot the ball is something that is a pretty good fit next to Booker, and that not a lot of traditional point guards have necessarily. If they need to get some kind of another option in there, you would think, if they're trying to improve this year, besides Knight and Ulis. And, for me, I probably would just roll with that. And then maybe you could try Booker some at point guard as well. Josh Jackson has some point forward skills, so maybe you just don't need a traditional point guard. But if you're going to get onto the point guard market here, who is there? It's a pretty sparse group.
Well, if Isaiah Thomas wants to make good and the Suns are trying to compete this year, that might be the best marriage. I mean, they would suck defensively, but at least they could score. And you get a better way to evaluate a lot of their other young guys in terms of the interior based on passing. I think it could actually be a very good thing for Ayton if they draft him. So it could go maybe a 1-year deal or some sort of, like we talked about that idea of, it doesn't fully guarantee or some sort of protection or even something for a second season. There is plenty of baggage with Isaiah in Phoenix, but I think opportunity is going to dictate for him. And outside of Isaiah, I don't think of any real point guards that make a ton of sense for what they're looking for.
And even Isaiah, I think I don't know if I want to add 30% usage rate to this team where you're trying to build up a little bit more of a culture, and there's already a lot of mouths to feed between Jackson, who shoots too much, Booker, who doesn't shoot too much anymore. Actually had a pretty efficient year last year, but if you're trying to work with Deandre Ayton as well, you've got Chris, who likes to get some shots up. I mean, they're TJ Warren as well. I mean, I think they have enough in terms of shot creators on this team. What they really need is shooting and defense to me. And yeah, I mean, there really is.
So I was going to ask you, so a couple other kind of like flyer restricted free agent point guards that I was like, maybe more they would be interested than I would be interested if I were their general manager. Fred VanVleet, Dante Exum, both interesting, kind of like, take a gamble on it if it's a price that you're happy with. I could see both of those as just being, kind of fitting with Booker a little bit and then eventually maybe sliding to the backup like I talked about with Marcus Smart.
Yeah, VanVleet as a shooter and a guy who at least will give effort defensively and a pretty unselfish player is not a bad fit with Devin Booker at all. That's something that I might actually consider if I were Phoenix, especially considering how young he is. Now, are you really want to go big enough with him as an arenas restricted free agent to pry him away from Toronto? That's probably going to end up being a bad contract, but the fit there is good, and there really are not that many. Actually, an interesting one to me, Danny, would be Milos Teodosic. Now he doesn't help their defense, but he can shoot the ball, and he's a good unselfish passer who could help get some of these guys involved. That's another thing that they just have zero of on this team is passing. Bender is probably their best passer and pretty nascent player right now and has a lot of other limitations. So that might be one if in fact Teodosic declines that player option, or if he were to get waived by the Clippers, might be something they could look at as just a way to make the team respectable and run better. And certainly Kokoshkov as a Serbian is going to be quite familiar with him. I know he coached Slovenia, but I'm sure he's very familiar with Teodosic's game. And so that could be something to look at if in fact he were to come free.
I would also like to see them just get one more shooter, ideally a shooting forward. There are a series of different ways if they want to go more on the low-cost front. Somebody like Anthony Tolliver, who would also fill some of the solid vet quota on this team, or Joe Harris if they could get him at a reasonable
they already
price.
have
just
Tolliver,
somebody to
and his name is Jared Dudley on the team. They're pretty redundant, and maybe they'll actually play Dudley a little bit this year if they're trying to win.
That is another one of my solutions. Yeah, actually playing Jared Dudley. We'll see. Oh, and just as a lottery ticket, I've set him for a lot of teams, but rolling the dice on Travion Graham would be interesting just as hey, if he could be a part of your rotation, if he comes at a reasonable cost, I'd be fine with that too.
Yeah, and really, I think the fact that the Suns got the number 1 overall pick and are likely to take Ayton is a big problem for the rest of the centers now. I mean, we saw this happen with point guards last year with guys like George Hill, who had to settle in Sacramento after turning down $80 million from the Jazz. And whether it's Capella, Yusuf Nurkic, there are a lot of guys who were counting on having the Suns as a potential destination because they so desperately needed a center, and now they're going to have Ayton, and they're probably planning on starting him, and they already got Tyson Chandler as sort of like the vet backup. That takes one of the few center suitors out of the market.
You brought up that the Suns have 1 in 16. We should also mention that they have 31, which is an incredibly valuable pick because not tied to the rookie scale, could be interesting in terms of who is available then. And then, hilariously, they also have 59 just because I guess they want to draft a guy and just bury them in Europe for a couple of years.
Yeah, well, 31 can be a very valuable pick for getting a European who might have a big enough buyout that a late first-round pick wouldn't work very well for him. So then you can do that pick, stash him for a couple of years, and then you're not subject to the rookie scale if you do want to bring him over at a later time. I think that's about all I got on these guys.
Yeah, I think so for me as well. I will mention that I have a couple of things. One out, Real Jam Radio with Ben Golliver. We talked about the finals, talked about LeBron. It was a fun conversation. I also have a piece coming out for The Athletic on Monday about Kevin Durant's free agency paths, so like opting in versus non-bird versus early bird and all those kind of logistics. That'll be out. And then off-season previews rolling on strong for The Athletic as well. I think the Kings one is going to come out on Monday. I'm not entirely sure of that.
All right, I want to thank Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring today's program. They deliver everything you need to look, feel, and smell your best. Not just shaving, shampoo, conditioner, body wash, toothpaste, hair gel, butt wipes. Those are actually essential for hygiene, in my personal opinion. And a great way to try a bunch of Dollar Shave Club's products is their Daily Essentials Starter Set for just $5. It comes with body cleanser, their One Wipe Charlie's, their world famous shave butter, and their best razor, the 6-blade Executive. And then you can keep those blades coming for a few more bucks a month. Add in shampoo, toothpaste, anything else you need. So no more having to run to the store when you realize, oh yeah, I'm out of toothpaste and I don't really have a choice. I have to go to the store. Well, if you're getting it delivered, don't have to worry about that anymore. The way to get started with them, dollarshaveclub.com/capspace is that URL. Once again, dollarshaveclub.com/capspace. Let them know that you came from us with that /capspace URL.